Hi, everybody. I think we got everything set up here. Feels a little strange just to be doing this without knowing if everybody's here or not. So anyway, I'm gonna just kick right off here. My name is Shaun Baer. I'm a developer at Bluecadet. I'm here today to talk about building decoupled CMS-agnostic front ends. I work at Bluecadet, which is an Emmy Award-winning agency, which sounds so fancy. We create world-class websites, mobile apps, interactive installations, and immersive environments. We do a lot of work with museums, cultural institutions, universities, progressive brands, nonprofits. A lot of great work. Check us out. Bluecadet.com is the website. There's a lot of great stuff up there. So what am I talking about today? What is this title? Decoupled CMS agnostic what? What I'm talking about is front-end code that can exist outside of a specific CMS framework. Something that exists on its own, separate from a CMS stack. And then something that can easily be integrated with any CMS. What I'm not talking about is a headless system that runs on like Gatsby or something like that. I'm also not talking about a reactor view built on top of a CMS. I'm just talking about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript existing outside of a CMS. But before I get too deep into how this decoupled system actually works, I want to take a minute to talk about two things, design systems and pattern libraries. This talk is kind of rooted in those concepts, so I just want to explain these things really quick. I feel like they're important. Design systems. It's a pretty hot term. I'm sure you've probably seen any number of Medium articles that start with design systems are blah, 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 blah. They're everywhere right now, and for good reason. So why am I talking about them here? And what are they? This is my interpretation. Design systems are the result of product design evolution. They're a way to maintain, oops, I'm moving my zoom around here. It's okay. Yeah, so sorry. Design systems are the result of product design evolution. They're a way to maintain visual and interactive elements consistently across a product or application. At the core, a design system is really about a visual language and the rules around it. So colors, typography, grid, spacing, layouts. The rules that set up how those things work visually are what compromise a design system. And why do they exist? Why are they a thing? They're really for designers or developers in the future. So somebody coming onto a project, once a design system is built, somebody coming into the project can easily reference those rules, reference the things that have been done before them to help make new components for the site or the product that look like they're part of the product. In other words, once you set up these rules, designer developer can come in, they can say, oh, your spacing is set up in units of 8, so I can build this card with 24 pixels of padding or 36 pixels of padding on the bottom, and my font sizes are matching everything else. And they end up very easily being able to build, this new component without having to ask another designer a bunch of questions because they just follow a set of rules. A really good example of this is the material design system made by Google. All 4 of these things here look pretty much the same. They share a common language between all of them, and these are 4 separate videos that I just got off of Dribble. They don't actually work for Google, but they look like they're part of the material theme because they're following the rules of that design system. InVision also made this design system manager. So if a designer is working in Sketch, they can upload their files to InVision and include them in this design system manager to help document colors, textiles, components. And this system does a pretty good job of organizing things. The more crazy a designer wants to get with their designs and how they're building those sketch files, the better of an organized product this will be. And it's also nice because they start thinking like a developer to some degree, because they start breaking things out into parts. But what about developers? That design system is useful. It's not code though, it's just design. So how can we as developers take that and take the idea of that design system and turn it into production code? How can we turn it into production code that's also performant, consistent, and easily accessible to other developers and designers? Meaning, how can we build a thing that, like a design system, helps tell people coming onto the project things that we have done? How do we do that? It seems kind of easy, and the answer to it is really easy, is that we just document the code base. We make sure that people know where code exists, what kind of classes we're writing, things like that. But what's the fastest way to be able to do that? It's to document the code base with the code itself. And the way that we can do that is with another thing called pattern libraries. And what are pattern libraries? They're effectively a code manifestation of a design system. So it's not quite the design system itself, it's that those designs taken and broken out into code. They're living documents. They describe and render the code, and they typically cover things like grid, utility classes, all the things that you're pouring your hard work into as a front-end developer. They should live in a pattern library. They're basically the website, but broken down into tiny little reusable pieces. So pages broken down into big content sections, broken down into like tiny headers and accordions and buttons and all that stuff. And then the pattern library is all of those pieces broken out individually. So why is there a distinction? Why are they not just the same thing? Why is it a design system and a pattern library in my mind? To me, it's about intent. I'm not a designer. I often joke that I'm the Ron Burgundy of front end. So if it's in a sketch file, I'm going to write it in code. The same way Ron Burgundy will read a question mark if somebody put it on the teleprompter. So, you know, I'm thinking about the design, but I'm not thinking about the design in the same way as a designer. I'm thinking about the implementation of it in code. So one thing about both of them is that both design systems and pattern libraries is that they're going to share rules, but as a developer, I have different concerns. My concerns are more about, you know, being able to reuse components, being able to like keep a check on performance or file size. Also, data models are very important as a developer versus as a designer. You know, they're just coming up with a title and content and all this stuff. I don't mean to make that sound trivial at all. But yeah, pattern libraries are also broken down into different ways. They're code libraries, they're not design libraries. So some ideals of a pattern library is that similar to design systems, we want future developers to be able to come in, find the code that exists already and reuse it, or at least look at the rules and be able to reuse those rules to make new stuff quickly and easily without having to bother everybody with every tiny little detail question. We also want to be able to have backend devs be able to come in and see the data that needs to be delivered to a specific component. We want to be able to render components. So we want to be able to, you know, have markup for what a button is, but then also be able to like display what that button looks like when it's being rendered in the browser. And we also want to be able to include documentation. We want to over document when we can, just to be able to talk about these things that we built and how they can be used. Some really great examples of pattern libraries are MailChimp. It's really great. Atlassian is phenomenal. Not only does it have all of their code stuff, it also includes things like brand-centric content, a couple extra brand-centric things in addition to just code. Now, at this point, I know that you're, so the US design system is also using it too. So if you go to fill out your your 2020 census, you probably ended up looking at some components from their pattern library. So at this point, you might be asking yourself, why is this guy talking about these things? I thought I was here to hear about a decoupled CMS-agnostic front end. Where's that at? Well, the two are relevant here because if designers start out talking or thinking and designing in this design system language, if they start out with this, it's really quick for a front-end developer to be able to get to that pattern library. And then once that pattern library exists, it's very easy to get to the whole entire website because the website is then just built out of all these different components. So it's just a matter of getting those pattern library components into the front end of the website itself. And okay, but that's still not the CMS agnostic front end. Yes, but if we have all of those templates in a pattern library and the pattern library is going to be used to build the website, what if the pattern library was just the front end? Wouldn't that be magical? And the answer is yes, it would be magical to just be able to build this one thing that self-documents and then have that be the website. That would be great. But before we get to that, a little background on how Bluecadet got here. We had a number of projects. We had a bunch of front-end developers. We did not have as many back-end developers, and we particularly did not have as many Drupal back-end devs as what we needed at the time. Project overlaps caused some time constraints for the Drupal devs, and we needed a way for front-end to start before back-end devs could, which is a little tricky when you're trying to deal with a CMS and getting data from that. And we wanted it to happen in a meaningful way with as little refactoring as possible. So we had heard of and tried a number of style guide generators and pattern library tools, but they all required HTML to be copied and pasted into Drupal's template system. So front-end devs could build stuff, but then we still needed to copy and paste that into Drupal's template system. Not every front-end dev could do that. The template system's a little confusing in Drupal. So yeah, we ended up having to refactor a lot of code once we got from the style guide to Drupal. But then a colleague, Chris Harrison, read this article by Rachel Andrew on Smashing Magazine. Highly recommend it. The link is at the bottom, and I can also put that in the Slack channel afterwards. But because of this article, we stumbled into Fractal. And what is Fractal? It's a component library system. It runs on Node. It has powerful features, but it also, in addition to those like native features that allows you to extend the application a lot, organize components and documentation the way that you want to. And what does it look like? Well, you've actually already seen it because the US web design system pattern library uses Fractal. So if we take a look at this, Fractal really is just this nice tool that you can use to write HTML, and you can have the component rendered, and then you can have the HTML markup below it, as well as a couple other things. And to show it off a little bit more, I'm gonna get out of my talk here and go into a Fractal demo. I'm gonna pull this guy down now. Sorry, this is gonna take a second or two to switch over. Suddenly I have a million windows in a very small space. Okay, so this is a locally running instance. Like I said, Fractal runs on Node, so I'm just running a browser sync instance on my machine here that's serving Fractal. You can also build out static Fractal sites too, which is really nice, pretty easily. So if you install Fractal, or before I get into that, I just want to throw out that this is not like a complete out-of-the-box Fractal instance, but it's pretty close. We added a gulp file that can that we're using to compile Sass and JavaScript within here. But this is pretty much what Fractal looks like out of the box. And you start out with this fractal.js file. This is kind of the heart of the Fractal system, where you tell it, like, This is the folder to look for components. This is the folder to look for docs. There's a good amount of info on their website about how this works, so I encourage you to look at that. But to look at an actual component here, which on the front end, we have this list of components. If we take a look at button here, we have 3 different types of buttons. In the back end, there's just one component file, which is this button. Here we're using handlebars, so button.hbs. And in here, we have a bunch of markup with some if statements. The thing that powers this template, and I'll click into this default button, the thing that is powering this button is this file called a config.js file, so button.config.js. This file is being pulled into this template, so we can pass in data in a separate file, and then the button template will display that data. So we're able to pass context, so we have text and URL. If we look in the handlebars file, we have this URL, we have the text, so that stuff's being pumped out. But then we are also able to make these variants and give them names and labels. So that's what you're looking at here in the sidebar, is that we have these other components and we're just passing in different data models to each of them. And as a result, they're being styled differently. So here I have a conditional class, like if this mod data bit exists in this file, print that out, which then I end up producing button.alert. In Fractal itself, you can also look at the HTML that's being pumped out. So you have that HTML right next to the rendered component. You also have this view, which is your template. You have notes. If you include a README file in the same directory as that component, that README file will output here. You can also look at assets. So if you have JavaScript or Sass files next to the component, you can actually just view them in here. And context also gets shown as well. So the data that's being pumped into each of these components you're able to look at that and view that. You can put, if you don't have a variant, it just appears as a single link. And we have the ability to also have a folder that then has multiple components inside of it. You can also hide components by putting an underscore before them, and they won't show up under here in the sidebar. But if we take a look at this example component, we can see that in here I have this information that I'm bringing in, but then I'm also able to render the button component inside of this example component. So that's printing out here. And then I'm also rendering a hidden component as well. Or yeah, rendering the hidden component as well, which does not appear in the sidebar, but I'm still end up bringing that content in. So that's really useful just to point out, for if you have a map or something like that, that you're not able to actually have it be documented in your system, you can still have these hidden templates that you can use and bring into places. So yeah, that's a really quick jaunt through Fractal and what it looks like out of the box. I'm gonna jump back into Keynote here. So just to go through some pros that we found about Fractal and why we ended up using that and not another system. You have, there we go. The code examples are there. So you can see the code, you can see the rendered component next to it. You can have documentation of your CSS and your Fractal element next to each other. With a little help from Open Webpack, you can compile all that into its own Sass file, into its own CSS file. But one of the more important things that we have here is that data injection into the template. So if we think about how that works for a minute, if we think about that model, we have the Fractal config file, which we're having set up and pumping in this data to Fractal. So within Fractal itself, we have button.config.js, and we have button.handlebars. The config file is pushing in data that we hard coded into Fractal. But if we think about that data in another way, we might be able to do something like write a PHP array that then gets pumped into that template. We might be able to write that in WordPress or in Drupal and pump that into this Fractal template, because that template is just existing to consume data. That template, it just wants to eat. It doesn't care what you're feeding it as long as that data matches what it's expecting. So that's a very important thing to think about when we're getting into what we're making here. But also, an important part to being able to connect those two is having an appropriate template render engine option. Those three words are really hard to say next to each other. But yeah, if we look through Fractal's options, we see that it uses handlebars out of the box, but it also uses mustaches. It also uses nunchucks for you apostrophe folks. But for Bluecadet, the real chef's kiss is twig. And I never really thought I'd be giving twig a chef's kiss, but really excited to see that here. We can write templates in twig. And yeah, twig is a pretty great system, especially for including components, because we can include components and pass parameters to the component to overwrite like the native object that's it's expecting. So yeah, we can write twig, but what does it mean? Well, Drupal natively uses twig, and WordPress has Timber, which uses twig. And it's pretty easy for front-end devs to pick up twig pretty fast just on its own, which kind of feels like we might have the power to connect this pattern library to a CMS. But how do we get that done? There are some challenges to it. Fractal has its own way that it wants to organize components within its directory. Drupal has an expectation for how you should be pointing to templates. So in Drupal in particular, if we install this module made by Wondrous LLC, you're able to then just make these include statements that can end up matching what the include statements that Fractal will end up expecting. So with Fractal, you're going to want to do like include at Fractal/component, which should be pointing to a directory named component, and then within it there should be a file named component.twig. So this module really helps you to kind of like get through that. WordPress, we ended up writing a library for, or a plugin for Timber, which works well, and similarly, or you have to install Timber, and then we wrote a plugin that works with Timber, so you can do the same thing and have those include statements work together. Also, injecting data, that's another thing, gets a little bit tricky, and you gotta do some proper setup. So first in Fractal, you're gonna have to make sure that you're using a twig rendering engine. There's a lot of documentation on that on their website. Also, you should make sure that the Fractal instance lives inside of the theme, both for Drupal and for WordPress. And then once you do that, you just have to make sure that you're getting your handle prefixes. So here we're using at Fractal in that twig definition. You also want to make sure that you have those same things passed to the CMS as well. So all of those include statements match up. So in theme.info.yaml in Drupal, we're going to have to add this little statement in, which is just saying where we have the components living. More info on the Wondrous module, talking about how to set that up. For WordPress, you just have to put some definitions in functions.php, and then you're kind of on the same track for Fractal components within the theme and how Fractal will end up including its own statements. Yeah, and then once we have that, like this, for example, could be a page.php in WordPress, and we can just start including these Fractal components and passing in our own data object to overwrite the one that exists in Fractal. So we're matching the data model that is in Fractal, we're just giving it CMS data instead of giving it default hard-coded Fractal data. We can also do that with Drupal as well. If we want to be able to keep these things drier, maybe we don't want to have in page.php, we don't want all these like giant include statements. We can find a way to write a class or something like that that just passes a more simple array to that include object. But basically the way that you end up passing this data to Fractal is however you would deliver content to that page. You keep doing that, but instead of rendering that data in the CMS template itself, you're including a Fractal component and passing the data to that to be rendered. And now we're going to take a quick look at an actual project that we have. That's actually a production project. So this is a pretty large scale project. There's a bunch of templates and a bunch of things going on here, but this is a WordPress project, and you can see we have our theme file, and then we have our Fractal library inside of there. And we're actually, instead of calling it components, we're calling it patterns here because I felt fancy. We have stuff broken across into brand. So we have like, you know, colors that we're using on the website. We have, you working here? My computer is running in overdrive, trying to do a presentation and serve 5 local sites. But yeah, so we have a bunch of colors, logos, we have all of the headings. Is this really not going to load right now? Oh. Live code fail. Okay, well here's, yeah, so we have heading styles, we have colors, maybe. Maybe I'm breaking colors currently. The thing that I really want to get to here is a particular block. So let's see if we can get that to load. In the back end, in this component, we have a block file, or yeah, we have the twig file that we are using to render this. If we look at it on the front end, because it did load, yay. We have a title, we have a tagline, we have the CTA, and then we have these 2 links that have images. And if we kind of break this out, we end up seeing that like this is a component that we end up seeing across the site. So we actually have another component called call out content in here that we can reference inside of this 2-up teaser block. So here we're actually including another Fractal component inside of this Fractal component, and we're pushing data to it. So we're able to keep using this same component across the site without having to rewrite code. We're just passing new data to it. And then we have this, which is repeated twice here. So that's its own component, which is an image teaser. And that image teaser can take in a link if we want it to. It has its own data model in terms of what it's expecting. So in this 2-up teaser block, we can also then include that. So then once we build those 2 things, anytime we end up building something like this that needs this title or this image teaser, we're able to just reuse those components very quickly, very easily. And then on the live site itself, we have this page. This is coming from WordPress. This is page.php. And in here, you know, we have a lot of ACF flexible fields that we're using to generate all these different things. But down here, we have this 2-up teaser block. This is actually being rendered directly from this block. So if I make a change in terms of CSS or markup in this file, in this twig file, it's also going to be updated here on the front end. So we're able to document everything here in Fractal. We're able to show off the HTML. If we have any notes about it, we can write notes in there. We have everything in one nice place. We're able to reuse code, and it's all living in the front end without living in the front end, without being WordPress specific. Yeah, so that's kind of a look at it at the project level. Let me minimize these, jump back, kind of running short on time here. So I'm gonna try to breeze through a couple things. So is this truly a CMS agnostic front end? The answer is yes, but like 99% yes, because we have found a couple of things that are just different between Drupal and WordPress, and I'm sure others as well. They're pretty similar, but there's just some things that are different, and to kind of talk through those things that we found, I'll do that now and hope that it helps. So in Drupal in particular, we found that it's better if you expect images to be a string instead of like wanting an object that's like source and alt and setting up a fancy kind of thing. It's better to just say like, Drupal, give me the image string with the source and the alt, because maybe you're doing like rendering responsive images and stuff like that. So most of the time when you're setting up your data models, expect strings for images. Also block renders and twig, you should be using those, especially for views. They work really well. Menus are just hard, and this is why I say it's 99%, is that you might end up needing to write some code in a Drupal template still to get menus to render out into Fractal components. But the amount of code that you'll be writing in Drupal will end up being small. Also links, sometimes you're going to get a string, sometimes you're going to get a URL. Maybe it's better to think about your data models beforehand and say like, how am I expecting to get like a button laid out? Should it be a link inside of a wrapper that then styles that link versus like always having a link with a class on it? Also JavaScript is important. You can't just share a JavaScript file between Fractal and Drupal because Drupal, with JavaScript, you end up passing in like Drupal settings. And if you try to run that in Fractal, you're going to get a console error and JavaScript's going to stop running. So you should really have separate app files and Fractal files. WordPress is the Wild West when it comes to organization, especially in this case. If you take a look at Timber, they have some really good starter themes that you can look at for organizing their files, but then you still have to figure out a way that you want to organize how you're passing the data to a Fractal file. So standardization is up to you, but you should do it. Also, determining a way to organize data methods. So in functions.php, maybe you're going to write a bunch of functions. Maybe you're going to write a class that you end up including in functions.php. But you know, that's kind of up to you to decide how you want to do that. It should just be consistent in the back end. Also, leveraging Timber's global context is really important here. So putting menus into the global context is a great thing that is very useful. Also, there's potential use for Gutenberg here. Timber, you can write ACF blocks that you can put into Gutenberg. Timber can actually interject and say like, hey, render a Timber template when you're rendering an ACF block. But then you can point that Timber template to a Fractal component. So you can have those components living in Fractal and be able to use them in Gutenberg. I haven't done this yet, but it's possible. I haven't done it in production, I should say, but it's possible. And if you do it, hit me up because I want to know more about that. One big thing that we found that's important is to remember this slide. The reason that we want this pattern library to be around is so that other people can look at it, find it useful, reuse code, so that the further that this project goes, the faster it will go, because we are reusing, documenting, you know, we're building a better future through this pattern library. So just make sure that you're doing these things and that your pattern library is as ideal as it can be, and that, yeah, you're making life easier for everybody. And you do that by documenting everything. So creating custom components that display colors, that heading component that I showed you is something that was custom that we built, displaying how your grid works, even utility classes, making a component that displays all of the reveal animations that you have, telling people how those class names work and stuff like that is very important. And they're not components that they're probably not components that you're going to render on the front end itself, but they're important to the pattern library as a piece of documentation. So a pattern library really ends up being what the front end is and also the documentation, both of those things at the same time. And make sure that you're writing notes. I personally reference a Fractal project constantly while I'm building a site. And remember that documentation isn't about you, it's about who's next, so be nice to them, because that might also be you in a year from now when you completely forget everything that you just built and you're like, how do I make a image appear from the bottom and fade in? If you document it, you'll know. Also, another big thing is to create reusable components. Once you start building code like this, you'll find that you can reuse components over and over again. And if you make your own Fractal library of components, you can start reusing them through from project to project. You don't have to write a nav in a new way every single time. They're great for things that you can build all the time and you can document it. At Bluecadet, we have a Fractal library that we use all the time called the sauce pot. And we, in particular, we have a bunch of accessibility components like this drop-down nav, which hits WCAG AA requirements. It took us a very long time to craft this and get it working, but now on a new project, somebody can just visit this library, say, oh, I need a fully accessible drop-down menu, copy this code into a new project, and then style it to match. They're not rewriting HTML. So there's a lot of components like this that we can just reuse. The JavaScript is there, the base Sass is there, the markup, it's all there. And we can just grab it and dump it into a new project and quickly plug the CMS into that template, and it's all hooked up and it's running pretty quickly. That was a lot. And yeah, I know, and I'm sorry, I talked really fast and I probably jumped over a few things, I'm sure. My email is shaun.baer@gmail.com if you have questions, and thanks. And now, if there are questions, I will open up the gates, I think. Or moderator, do you open the gates? Are the gates open? Anybody have any questions? Cool. Well, I will be in the Slack channel as well. I'll be on the CMS affiliate Slack. You can either DM me or feel free to reach out on the channel if you have questions. So.
Hey everybody, this is Byron, the other moderator type guy. I'm actually getting there's going to be a raffle in a couple of seconds, I guess, and I'm trying to get information. Okay, so if you go into the general channel on Slack, I'm assuming that everybody has gotten into Slack. If you go into the general channel, you'll be able to enter the raffle or see whatever it is that you have to do. So I just want to say thank you, Shaun, for that wonderful presentation. Yeah, who knew that people would like Twig, right? Yeah. So without further ado, I see in the general channel, you guys can just drop out here. This was recorded, and later we will post for everybody links to all of the recorded sessions so you can view them on your own time in case there was something that you missed. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.